Okay, here I am talking to myself, but that's okay. It's midterm week, so people are probably studying. Let's pretend that it's not that, and it's not my deodorant or something. We're going to talk about conformity today, chapter 8, how people conform and why they conform. Conformity is a change in behavior or belief as a result of real or imagined group pressure. Conformity, and of course we see conformity all the time. All you need to do is turn on the television or look in the internet and you have individuals that are following select people on blogs. There are people that dress the same way. If you go to high school, you look at a senior class, you look at a freshman class, you see everybody in the freshman class wearing the same kind of clothes. Potentially they have the same hats on. It gets a little strange. But of course the conformity that we see in high school doesn't stop. It continues. These individuals and some people will try to impress their reference group for the rest of their lives. Dressing the same way, acting the same way, having the same beliefs that they did before. One of the things that we saw in the last election is that there was a great deal of conformity going on in the United States. and that may be one of the reasons why President Trump was elected, because people were conforming to that concept. So conformity is what we're going to talk about today. Francis is coming in, and at least I'll have somebody to talk to. Conformity tends to occur even in large groups. If you watched the rally that President Trump had over the weekend in Pennsylvania, you can see a lot of people holding up the same signs as other people in the area. It's really kind of interesting. And the question is conformity good or bad? Well, it all depends on who you are and where you are. It's bad when it leads to incorrect behavior. So if Francis is a pot smoker and I want to be like Francis, well, here I am. I've got to be like Francis, so I'm going to smoke pot too. And of course, in that case, conformity is not good. Conformity is bad. If Francis drives after he's had a snootful, and I want to be just like Francis, well, I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I'm going to drink and drive as well. However, if it has something to do with social organization, I see Francis standing in line, waiting patiently to go next. Then I will do the same thing, and that's a positive thing. That it allows us to operate in society. Sometimes it's just completely inconsequential. The clothes that we wear. Today I have on a Hawaiian shirt, as you can see. I have on a Hawaiian shirt. I have on a Hawaiian shirt, and I will be wearing Hawaiian shirts all week because this is midterm week, and I don't know, it's my mindset, I guess. I haven't convinced any of the other faculty to start wearing Hawaiian shirts. Or maybe they haven't been to Hawaii. Yeah. That's a possibility. As I told you before, I went to Hawaii twice on my honeymoon. Actually, it was the same wife, so you too, huh? And you.
I'm gonna plan one like that.
That's your plan. Okay.
I'm gonna marry in Vegas and jet plane to Hawaii for the after party.
After.
Yeah, and then come back.
I'll tell you what, it's paradise over there. It's always 80 degrees in Hawaii. Sometimes it gets up to 88, and sometimes it goes down to 78. But that's about the.
I'll wear Hawaiian shirts all the way.
There you go. You bring them all back and wear Hawaiian shirts every day. In Western cultures, conformity is considered to be negative, of course. It shows submission and compliance. In Eastern cultures, conformity is seen as a positive thing, communal sensitivity, responsiveness, cooperative team play. And for that reason, of course, we look at conformity differently. Things that would happen in Japan or China wouldn't happen in the United States. They try to do the same thing. I'm reading a book right now. It's got a really interesting title, but it's from China, and the guy's name is Mo Yan. That's the guy's name. That's not his actual name. It's a nom de plume. It's a name for a writer, and the reason that he has that name is because he doesn't want people to know who he actually is, because he's afraid that if they find out that he's been writing these relatively controversial books, they will punish his family for it. He is in China. He lives in China. He's one of the most popular authors in China, but he still doesn't go by his actual name. His name is Mo Yan. Mo Yan means don't speak, and that's what his... He's always been a nonconformist to some extent, and that's what he writes about, being a nonconformist. And his parents always told him, don't speak. In other words, don't talk about this outside the house. It's okay to talk about it in the house, but don't talk about it outside the house. And so, since he was told that over and over and over again, he decided to adopt that as his name. So now his name is Don't Speak, as odd as that sounds. The title of the book, this is really kind of interesting. The title of the book seems kind of obscene. It sounds like something pornographic. The title of the book is Big Breasts and Wide Hips. Any guess as to what the book is about?
Women's rights?
I'm sorry?
Women's rights?
Women's rights, that's a good point, and that's pretty close to what it's about. It's about the fact that women rule the world because they can reproduce. And what's a sign of their ability to reproduce is the fact that when they're pregnant, of course, their breasts grow and their hips widen, and for that reason. And if you've ever been to China or been around Chinese people, they're relatively thin-hipped and flat-chested, but when they're pregnant, of course, their hips widen. Yeah, it's fairly obvious with that culture. If we look at the European culture, the women look that way most of the time, but in China, it's not that way. They grow when they're pregnant, and we won't go into that. But that's why he named it that. My wife. So I bought the book, and my wife came to visit me last week. And she thought it was it was a pornographic book, and I explained it all to her. I don't know that she believed me, but I got into a little bit of trouble because of it. Two types of conformity are compliance and acceptance. Compliance is conformity that involves publicly acting in accord with special pressure while privately disagreeing. Obedience is acting in accord with a direct order. So that's compliance. Acceptance is conformity that involves both acting and believing in accord with social pressure. A lot of times when we see social pressure, and this is what's going on right now with President Trump's assault on the media. What he's trying to get them to do, he doesn't just want them to comply, he wants them to accept. He wants them to accept his norm. He wants to create the norm, and he wants them to accept it. He feels that they did the same thing for President Obama. They did the same thing for President Bush, and he's not getting that the same reaction from them. So he not only wants them to comply, but he also wants them to accept. He wants to be able to dictate what they say, which is really kind of interesting, since. I was watching a news program last night, and they were saying, he needs to look at the Constitution, because the Constitution doesn't talk about political parties, but it talks about a free press, and he needs to back off on on attacking the media, because that's part of the Constitution. That's part of our country. In the middle 1930s, Muzaffar Sharif conducted the first psychological studies on conformity at Columbia University. This is in the 1930s. Why the 1930s? Why in the world would he even look at conformity? What did the 1930s have to do with anything? What was going on in the world? Why is conformity suddenly an important thing? Before World War II, we didn't even think about this kind of stuff. And the reason we didn't is because if you looked at Europe, you had the royal families controlling all the governments in Europe. So it wasn't a fact of conformity. It didn't have anything to do with conformity. It had to do with traditions. And the First World War was fought primarily, or kind of, as a traditional war, as one royal family versus another royal family, as odd as that may seem. But after World War I, of course, most of those royal families lost their power. The Tsar in Russia stepped down, and the Bolsheviks took over in Russia. In Germany, the Kaiser stepped down, and they tried to establish a republic. So it looked like democracy was taking over in Europe. So what was everybody's fear in the 1930s? Well, politically, we got two different types of pressure. One of the pressures came from the left, and the other pressure came from the right. The Bolsheviks, of course, were communists. They were socialists. They came out of the anarchic movement at the end of the 20th century. So we were afraid, people were afraid that because we are like sheep, humans are like sheep because they conform, this whole idea of Bolshevism would just take over the world. But at the same time, we were getting pressure from the right. That was pressure from the left. We were getting pressure from the right because the fascist movement started in Italy in 1923. By the 1930s, the Nazis, the Nazi Party in Germany had started to take over. Had started to take over. So we had all this conformity taking place all around the world. Some of it was right wing, some of it was left wing. We had a revolution starting in Spain, a fascist revolution. And one of the interesting things about the war in Spain was the fact that it was the communists versus the fascists. It was really kind of interesting. So we had the two extremes actually coming to blows with one another. That had taken place in Germany before. It was a fairly peaceful uprising. Not that many people were killed, but here we had a war going on in Spain. And for that reason, a lot of people joined the battle, despite the fact they weren't Spanish. A lot of Americans went over there and fought. And a lot of Russians went over there and fought. And as a matter of fact, most of the Americans that went over there were not fascists. They were communists. So it was really kind of an interesting situation. Ernest Hemingway went over there and fought for the Republic. Really kind of interesting situation going on in the 1930s. So Sharif, who was an Egyptian, decided that he was going to do research on conformity, just to see how strong conformity was. Sharif put three people in a room, and he had them watch a light. It's really kind of an interesting phenomenon. If you are, I don't know if you've ever been outside at night and looked at a stationary light in the distance, but it looks like it's moving. And this is really kind of interesting. This is one of the things they taught us to do when we were in the military. If you were a sentry at night, they told you not to look directly at something. They told you to, if you saw a light, that you should look away and then look back at it, trying to determine what was going on as far as the light was concerned. Anyway, so he put three people in a darkened room, and he had them watching a light. He wanted to know about the movement of the light. That's what he wanted to know. By the end of the day, though their initial estimates were very different, they all agreed to a group norm. Initially, of course, one would say the light was moving, one was saying the light is moving to the left, the other would say the light is moving to the right. Eventually, of course, he allowed them to talk, and when they talked to each other, they came up with a norm. In other words, they all conformed to each other's ideas. They came up with one idea. So they would agree, yep, the light's moving to the right. or they'd agree, you know, the light's not moving at all. But they conformed. The reality was, of course, the light wasn't moving at all. Okay, so the next day, they decided to do research at Northwestern University with exactly the same experiment. They decided to replicate it. Jacobs and Campbell did this at Northwestern University, but they used a confederate, and the confederate was the one that was adamant about whether it was moving at all, or whether it was moving to the right, or whether it was moving to the left. Of course, the reality is the light wasn't moving at all, but because your body can't stay stable, because your eyes don't stay stable, you have saccadic eye movements. Because of that, it looks like the light is actually moving, and this is known as the autokinetic phenomenon.
That explains everything.
I know, it explains everything. But they had a confederate, and the confederate was in there trying to convince everybody that his way was the way it was supposed to be. The experimenters used the confederate to plant the idea of movement, and the idea persisted over 5 generations of participants. So they were actually able, with one confederate planting an idea, they were able to get it to be repeated over 5 generations. So obviously suggestibility is a powerful force. If you can get anybody to say something specific, that's a good example is when they tried to sell you, they were trying to sell you property. They had confederates at each table, and those confederates were saying very positive things about the property, about the food, about the whole idea that they're feeding you all this wonderful food. It's and the music is just fabulous. And I'm sure they did that as far as you were concerned. They were hoping, and of course some people are fairly easily convinced, and that has to do with suggestibility.
We had the best spot in the restaurant. It was like on the corner spot where it overlooks everything.
How perfect is that?
And I was facing towards it, and their backs were against it.
Other researchers have done work with suggestibility. Peter Totterdell has identified a phenomenon known as mood linkage, where people who work together tend to reflect each other's mood, which is kind of fascinating. If you look at it, get rid of that. I work downstairs, and there's, I don't know, 6 or 7 of us downstairs, and sometimes when somebody's grouchy, everybody gets kind of grouchy, and they just try to stay away from each other. But when everybody's talking, and everybody's in a fairly upbeat mood, we all get together and we talk, and sometimes I don't get my work done because, and I'll blame Marius or Sue or Christine or whatever. Tanya Chartrand and John Barg conducted experiments where they had confederates making select gestures such as nose rubbing or foot bouncing. This is really kind of interesting. It's known as the chameleon effect. So and do this sometime. You know, if you're talking to somebody, rub your face, rub your chin, or put your hand on your face like that, and watch the other individual. They will mimic your behavior. They will do exactly what you do. I was sitting beside a Blackfoot guy. Andrea's not here today, so I was sitting beside a Blackfoot guy. Evidently, he's kind of ADHD. Anyway, he pops his leg up and down, and it just was driving me crazy. I mean, his leg was just popping up and down like he couldn't control it. It was really kind of interesting. And all of a sudden, his friend, of course I was his friend, but he had another friend sitting across from him, and all of a sudden his friend started popping his leg up and down. And then the guy started scratching his face like this, and Bobby was doing exactly the same thing. Everything that the other guy was doing, he was doing. So the two of them were starting this thing, and they started making noise, and of course the person that was in charge said, "Bobby, would you please stop making so much noise?" It was my boss. Suggestibility is not always harmless, of course. It is not uncommon for people to get ideas from what other people do. We had copycat murderers. Right after the Parkland shooting, we had, what, eight other shootings, or not actually shootings, but they were kids that were taking guns to school. All of a sudden, these individuals had been checked every day, and all of a sudden they started bringing guns to school. And the idea was that they were going to shoot up the school. And there were a number of instances where these individuals were, they had to take the guns away from them, they had to kick them out of school and whatnot. Hijackings, of course, if we see one hijacking, we see a number of hijackings. UFO sightings, if one person sees something. And actually there was something on there's a video, somebody has taken a video of a Navy plane encountering a UFO. It's going to be interesting because I'm just wondering if we're not going to have other sightings of UFOs because of that one video. Suicides. Unfortunately, suicides come in waves. I told you the story of working in Omaha back in the 80s. We had a suicide at Bryan High School. We had a suicide at Bryan High School. The next day we had another suicide at Bryan High School. 2 successful suicides. Unfortunately, the people that committed suicide, one was the lead cheerleader for the wrestling team, and the other was the captain of the football team, committed suicide. And they committed suicide days apart. And people were going, oh my goodness, they must have been in love. They didn't even know each other. One was a sophomore and the other was a senior. They had never taken any classes together. She wasn't a cheerleader for his team. They didn't even know each other. I mean, it was just kind of a copycat situation. They, in total, over the next 2 weeks, they had 17 suicides. They had 5 completed suicides, and they had 17 attempts. It was all copycat. It was people going, my goodness, she had everything going for her. He had everything going for him. If they can't make it, you know, I'm barely on the edge. If they can't handle it, you know, how in the world am I supposed to be expected to handle it? And they had 17. It's really kind of an interesting situation. I told you the story before because they brought in a team from New York City. This is in Omaha. They brought in a team from New York City. They volunteered to come in, you know, all these psychiatrists and psychologists from New York. And the kids couldn't understand a word that they said. That and the fact that they didn't understand the culture. They didn't understand, you know, Nebraska. Is Nebraska different from New York? No, everybody in the United States is exactly the same. No, they're not. These were farm kids. You know, these were kids from rural Nebraska, and the people coming in from New York were from New York City. They had no clue about these kids. And what stopped the suicides and what stopped everything was the fact that the kids rebelled against the psychologists and psychiatrists coming in, and they pulled together and got rid of these guys. And that's how they stopped the suicides, as odd as that seems. After Marilyn Monroe's suicide in 1963, the number of suicides in the United States increased by 12%. But it went down again. I mean, it went down again after about a month. Mass delusions are not imaginary. However, the circumstance usually involves people responding to otherwise overlooked symptoms. All of a sudden, everybody is seeing ghosts, or everybody's seeing Bigfoot. I've heard some stories about Bigfoot around here, which is really kind of interesting. We had the same thing going on in Montana. They started getting Bigfoot sightings after somebody planted footprints. They used my shoe. The guys up there, they're really big. I mean, they're tall, but they've got these little bitty feet. I mean, they're like, you never see anybody with a size 10. They're all size 9 and size 8 and size 7. They got these little bitty feet, and I've got size 12s. They took my combat boot, and they stepped it down. They put it down in the dirt, and then they dug around it and made it look like. I got my boot back.
There was an incident that happened here a couple of years ago. One of the instructors was retelling the story about it, where there was a white student that was from Midwest,
Uh-huh.
really big, heavy set, big feet, and he wanted to see the lake. So he walked from the dorms to the lake.
Oh no.
And when he got to the lake, it started raining. So his coming back from the lake, his shoes got stuck in the mud. So he came back barefooted, walking all the way back, walked through the campus, came back home, and the students next day, they were taking pictures of all these footprints around campus. And I think he explained everything all later on. Like, that was me. I came back from the lake. So everybody thought it was Bigfoot on campus.
Yeah, there we go. Well, you know I've got big feet. It's not my fault. I'm only 5'6". I've got size 12 feet. I mean, who has such large feet? I don't know. My brothers have small feet. So I have one brother with 8.5s. I have one brother with 11.5s, but he's like 5'10". And then my other brother is, I don't know, about a 9 or something. As strange as that seems, you don't see a 9 and a 12 being that much different. Actually, it's about that much different. Solomon Asch conducted several experiments in the 1950s dealing with the pressure of the group. Asch conducted experiments where all the participants but one were Confederates, and this had to do with group pressure. So why in the world in the 1950s would we, now remember we did conformity back in the 1930s because we were trying to figure out what was going to happen as far as fascism and communism was concerned. Or Bolshevism, actually, is what we were calling it back then. So why in the 1950s are we looking at group pressure? Why? Why did Milgram do his experiment?
Pressure was to squeeze out people.
Why in the 1950s and 1960s? Why were we doing that? We couldn't figure out why the Germans put up with the Nazis having their death camps and their concentration camps. We couldn't figure that out. It didn't make any sense to us. It's something that we had, actually we're the first ones that started it. We did exactly the same thing with the Indian tribes. Put them on reservations. Wouldn't let them leave. So we started it. The Spanish did it down in Cuba. The Brits did it in South Africa during the Boer War. But they were following us, and of course we didn't have death camp. Well, we did as far as Wounded Knee was concerned. But I mean, the Nazis had all these death camps where they were trying to exterminate a whole race of individuals. And it didn't make any sense to us. I mean, we just couldn't figure it out. So we were trying, and the Germans said, well, you know, we were ordered to do it, so we did it. And so that's what we were trying to figure out. We were trying to understand how group pressure and group conformity worked. So Asch did his experiment, and what he did, he had people gauging the length of lines, and he had a series. He had one line over here, and he had 3 lines over here, and he said, which one matches this line? And they would go along, and everybody get the right answer, everybody get the right answer, and then all of a sudden, all these Confederates would say the wrong one, and it was obvious that they were wrong. The question was, would the person that wasn't a Confederate, would they go along with group pressure, or would they give him the right answer? And the answer was 37% of the time the subjects went along with the group, despite the fact that it was obvious that the group was wrong. But they still went along with it, 37% of the time. So there are individuals out there that no matter how wrong something is, they'll do it anyway because the group says that's what it is. So despite the fact that they're incorrect, they will still agree with the group. And then we come along with Milgram. You understand Milgram? Do I need to explain? You guys understand Milgram? We've been over this over and over and over again. The Milgram experiment. We took 2 people in. Only one of them was ignorant of what was going on. The other guy was a Confederate. He shocked the individual. He said it had to do with educational research. And he shocked the individual. And of course he had that big machine. Let me see if I've got the machine. There's the machine right there. And of course all these toggles have to do with electrocuting people. This one says danger, danger, because that's may be deadly, that kind of thing. So they knew that there was a point, that not everybody understands electricity, but the machine said that they may be killing the individual. And of course the guy next door is screaming. Really kind of fascinating stuff. Stanley Milgram wanted to know how far people would follow an authority figure, and of course that's what the Germans were saying, or that's what the German people were saying. We were ordered to do it. There was an authority figure. There was an officer of the Nazi Party there. They were telling us what to do, so we did what we were told. He tested 1,000 subjects and discovered that about 65% of the participants were willing to deliver the optimum punishment on the sham experimental subjects. And of course, when you have women in the class, women will say, well, that's men, women wouldn't do that. Well, the reality was that he did the experiment with women and he got exactly the same result. About 2/3 of the people, 2 out of every 3 people, were willing to do whatever the authority figure told them to do. And of course, this is what it looked like. This is them electrocuting the guy. They actually had the subject help secure the individual in their chair, so that they knew exactly what was going on. They knew, they saw the electrodes being attached to his hands and to his wrists. So they knew exactly what was going on. Milgram discovered that there were 4 factors to obedience. The victim's emotional distance from the victim. The victim's emotional, well, of course, the distance they were from that individual. Whether they felt similar to that individual. The more they felt like that person, the more likely they were to do it. An example would be, of course, he was using mostly white subjects, but if one of them was a minority and the other one was not, what is the emotional distance they have from this individual? And this may have something to do with police shooting African American males. Why in the world aren't they shooting white males? White males are just as stupid and ignorant and dumb and goofy. And why don't they shoot white people? Why don't they shoot unarmed white people?
Perception.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely correct. Yeah, it's their perception of who that person is. And they see black people as the enemy. They read the statistics and so who's the bad guy? Well, the bad guy is the person that has done something wrong, but they're not identifying whether something has gone wrong or not. They've had African Americans identified as the bad people. Why don't we hear about them shooting Hispanics, unarmed Hispanics, or unarmed natives, or unarmed Asian people? It's always unarmed black guys. You may have seen the video of the guy that started running away from the white cop. He had been talking to the guy, he started running away from the guy, and he shot him in the back. Not once, but 3 times. He shot him until he brought him down. And then he went up and shot him in the head. A kill shot. Who does that? This is in South Carolina. Anyway, the victim's emotional distance, the authority's closeness and legitimacy, whether or not the authority was institutionalized or not, and the liberating effects of a disobedient fellow subject. And we're going to talk about those right now. The emotional distance of the victim. Milgram's subjects acted with the least compassion when the shocked victims could not be seen. When they could just hear them, but they couldn't see them. When there were no protests from the shocked victim, the compliance was almost 100%. If they weren't, if they didn't know that the person was in distress, they just jacked him right up to the optimum. When the shock victims were in the same room as the subject, the compliance went down to 40%. So it was 65% if they were in another room. It went down to 40% if they could watch this guy, or they could look at him, or they could see the person in pain. When the guy wasn't making any noise, it was 100%. When the subject had to force the victim's hand onto the shock plate, the compliance went down to 30%. And this is an example. Shows exactly what's going on. This is the guy being shocked, and this is the guy doing the shocking, and he has to hold his hand down to the plate in order to comply. Combat has proven that Milgram is correct in his assumptions. The more distant or depersonalized the enemy, the easier it is to kill them. We've talked about this before. Nations at war will attempt to dehumanize the enemy in order to force their soldiers to kill them. Japs, these are names that we have given these individuals: Japs, Krauts, Heinies, Gooks, Slokes, Zipperheads, Ragheads, Camel Jockeys, Hajis. These are all names that we give to the bad guys. Why? Because it makes them, it dehumanizes them. You call somebody a gook. What is gook? Well, that's that slime on the ground. Why in the world would you call somebody a zipperhead? Camel jockeys. Who does that? Where in the world do they come up with all these names? At the same time, researchers have found that it is more difficult to abort a pregnancy when the mother has seen an ultrasound of her fetus. And there are different states that have tried to pass a law that if a mother wants an abortion, she has to have an ultrasound done, and she has to look at that ultrasound before she can decide. And of course, the Supreme Court has declared that unconstitutional. So, yeah, he was right. We try to depersonalize things. So what did the president say about the young man that shot up Parkland High School, who killed, what do you call him? Called him mentally ill. He called him a monster. He tried to depersonalize him. What does he say about terrorists? Every time there's a terrorist attack, he calls them cowards. He attacks them. He says negative things about them. But last weekend, I don't know if you were watching Save the Nation, but what did he? The guy on Save the Nation, Chuck Todd, he called him a son of a bitch. I know. He called a reporter a son of a bitch. He also called him sleepy, which I thought was kind of strange. Sleepy Chuck Todd, really kind of bizarre. He keeps doing these things. He's calling people things, calling people names, dehumanizing them in the eyes of his constituency. Now, if we don't like Donald Trump, then it doesn't really matter what he calls anybody. But he called, what did he call the Democrats the other day? He called them unpatriotic because they wouldn't vote the way he wanted them to. So he said that they were unpatriotic. So what he's doing, he's distancing one group from the other. That's what he's trying to do. He's trying to separate them. He's trying to depersonalize one group. And he may be successful. Every time he has a rally, he attacks the media. And the people in the audience agree with it. Reporters are starting to get death threats from these individuals because they say negative things about their beloved president. Closeness and legitimacy of the authority. Milgram discovered that when the authority figure stayed in the room with the subject, obedience was very high. When the authority figure was not in the room, the compliance dropped to 21%. So when they could do whatever they wanted, when the authority figure wasn't there watching them, the compliance went down markedly, from 65% to 21%. When the authority figure was perceived as illegitimate, compliance dropped by 80%. We just want you to shock this guy. If they saw him as illegitimate, it went down by 80%. When doctors order nurses, nurses obey, of course. Hofling did an experiment very similar to Milgram's. A lot of women will tell you that women are more sensitive than men, and men will do really mean things to people, but women wouldn't do that. Well, this was a case where Hofling called up 22 nurses, and he told them to give the patients an overdose. And of course, nurses are fairly bright. They know the dosages of things. They know how much can injure the individual. Well, this was twice as much as it would potentially overdose the patient. So it was a deadly amount of medication that they were giving this guy, and they knew it. 21% or 21 out of the 22 nurses still did it, despite the fact they knew that they were going to kill the patient. They didn't let them do it, of course. There aren't 21 dead people out there because of this experiment. The experiment was repeated 2 more times and they got exactly the same results. So when doctors, a legitimate authority figure, tells nurses to do something, the nurses will do it. Because the nurses don't think, they just obey. When my mother was working as a nurse, she used to lock horns with doctors all the time, arguing about whether they should do this or whether they shouldn't do that. And a lot of times she lost. But she still didn't do it. She didn't kill anybody just because a doctor made a stupid mistake. It's the nurse's responsibility to oversee the doctors. They're the ones that have direct patient contact. So that's their job, but sometimes they don't even think. They just do whatever the doctor says. Institutional authority, because Milgram did his experiments at Yale University, many of his subjects claimed that it was the prestige of the institution that made them comply to such a heinous command as to electrocuting this guy almost to the point of death. Milgram repeated his experiment as an unknown research group in Connecticut. Fewer people complied with the authority, but it was still almost 50%, 48% did. Even though it wasn't Yale University, it was just a research group out of Connecticut. Liberating effective group Defiance, Milgram discovered that when the subjects observed others disobeying the authority figure, they were likely to do the same. A full 90% followed the lead of their rebellious colleagues, proving that group influence can be liberating. So all you need is one guy, and then you kind of line up behind this guy. He takes the brunt of the assault, but you're willing to be behind him. Researchers discovered fairly quickly that people tended to conform when they felt incompetent. Group attributes that matter. Conformity is highest when a group has 3 or more people. So if there's only 2 of you, conformity is not, or dissent is not as easy, but if there's 3 or 4 of you, at least 3 people, it's easier to conform. When there's group cohesiveness, all of you agree, you all are about the same height, about the same age, then it's a little bit easier. When the group is unanimous, everybody agrees. When the group is high in status, and of course that's what's going on with the Trump administration right now. He nominated a lady by the name of Betsy DeVos as the education secretary. She doesn't seem to be very knowledgeable as far as education is concerned. Oh, he just got rid of his Secretary of State. Yeah, Tillerson. He fired Tillerson today, which is kind of interesting. A lot of individuals that he had in his cabinet were party hacks. They were party people. He's trying to fill his cabinet with individuals that are more like him. Well, who is he? Well, he's theoretically he has $7 billion. So Betsy DeVos, guess how many billions of dollars she has? She only has 2. But that's okay. So he's filling his cabinet with all these billionaires, people that are like him. And he considers money, of course, very, very important. So these are people high in status as far as he's concerned. Really fascinating watching what's going on with Donald Trump. It's almost like a civic experiment that we're going through right now. When the response is not public, when they can be, when they can do things in private, a lot of things that he does in public. What did he do? He did something about the steel industry. What did he do? He deregulated something, but it was never deregulated. He claimed that it was. He signed this executive order saying that it was deregulated, but it never was. Had something to do with steel. Anyway, so if it's not public, it's a lot easier to conform. When the group has made when they have made no prior commitment. So no matter what they say, and this is one of the problems with what happened at Parkland. After the Parkland shooting, of course there were a lot of people that were screaming that we needed to outlaw military-style weapons, get them off the streets. They were saying that you can't drink at 18, but you can buy an assault rifle at 18. We needed to raise the age to 21. And so what has happened? He has just come out with suggestions as to how to make schools safer. Did you guys hear what happened? What he wants to do to make schools safer?
Well, I think he pulled back the proposal for making the age limit
Right.
to 21.
Right.
That was one.
Exactly.
And then he still wants to have certain, not all, certain teachers basically carry firearms. That's
Right.
the last I heard.
Yeah, if they've had previous military training,
Yeah.
which should be interesting.
Yep.
Looking at the faculty here, guess who that would be?
You.
I'm the only guy. When I was at Ashford, we had a faculty. We had 57 people in the faculty, and there were 3 of us who had military training. 2 Army guys and me, and we were all Vietnam vets, and we all would have refused to carry weapons. However, I had the dean of my school was a arch conservative, and he claimed that he had a gun in his briefcase all the time. He never went anyplace without a gun. And I tried to figure out why he was so paranoid, but I never could figure it out.
I think like with the boarding school, most of the dorm mates were vets, really short-tempered. I remember a lot of the students getting once they reach that type, that part where it kind of there'll be a fight that will result to. What was that?
No guns though, huh?
No guns.
No guns, good. Yeah, guns scare me. It's if Edison wants to do damage to me, and he doesn't have a gun, he has to get right up next to me to hurt me. Well, I think maybe I can outrun you there, Edison. So if you got a knife, you better throw it at me, because I'm going to be down the stairs and out the door pretty quick. But if you've got a gun, you can kill me from 50 or 60 feet away. There's a huge difference between 73% of the murders in the United States last year were done by firearms. Knives, you have to get right up next to somebody. So what are we doing? We're get all kinds of interesting emails. According to Ash and the other researchers, the most conformity that can be generated by a group is when the group is made up of 3, 5, 4, or 5 people. You get 6 people, and it's easy for one person to dissent. But if you've got 3, 4, or 5 people, you've got a group that can actually conform to one another. The more over 5, the less compliance that can be expected. When looking at evidence, a group is more likely to listen to several small groups than one large group. And of course, that has to do with obedience. Unanimity, as Ash discovered with his work, it is very difficult for a lone dissenter in a group. However, if there is one other dissenter in the group, it is much easier for the second person to also dissent. Experiments show that 2 dissenters will actually feel very close and warm to each other, as if they're best friends, as odd as it may seem. Jesus sent out his disciples in pairs, according to Mark 1:21 through 28. I don't expect you to get out your Bible and look up Mark. If you ever do, then you'll find out that that's the way he did it. He sent them out in pairs. And of course, if you've ever been, we had some Mormon missionaries in Hogan housing the other day. They're always in pairs. There's always 2 of them. They always have black pants and white shirts, a tie. It doesn't have to be a black tie. But missionaries always go out in pairs. Having someone also dissent gives a second dissenter courage to dissent on subsequent examples. Group cohesion, when someone from outside the group dissents, it is more powerful than when someone inside the group dissents. This may be because we see people in the same group easily following one another, and this is known as cohesion. People follow, they do what everybody else is doing. It's a knee-jerk reaction. But outside the group, the likelihood of dissent is less strong. In an opposing group, the pressure is to be cohesive. Dissent from that group has much more power against us. Somebody from outside has to be cohesive. The higher the status of an individual, the more impact their opinion will have. Often people will avoid agreeing with low status or stigmatized people. Research in Australia showed that people responded to a well-dressed person better than a poorly dressed individual, both in the jaywalking experiment and the survey experiment. The jaywalking experiment was really kind of interesting. This was done in Australia, and what they did, they had people jaywalking at a certain point in a street. When it was a well-dressed person, they were more likely, other people were more likely to jaywalk. When it was a poorly dressed individual, nobody jaywalked with them. In other words, they didn't see it as something that they could possibly do. Nobody wanted to be identified with the poorly dressed individual. Really kind of interesting, I was at Blake's Lottaburger in Gallup on Saturday, getting a cheeseburger with no chilies. I can't handle the chilies. But I was...
Chili's the best part.
Is that right? I can't eat them. They burn a hole in my gut, so I'm a Hoosier. I apologize. I've been eating English food all my life, and it's not very spicy. Even my chili isn't very hot, so you know, the chili soup. Anyway, so I was at Blake's the other day, and there were people that were trying to get their food. They were going. Blake's always goes really slow. I mean, it takes time for them to cook their hamburgers for some reason. I don't know why that would be. But so there was a lady that had come up, and she was not dressed very well. And she screamed she wanted her hamburger right now. She'd been waiting for an hour or something, but of course she hadn't. But she said that she'd been waiting for a long, long time, and she needed her hamburger right now. And the lady said, well, we'll call you when it's done. We'll call you when it's done. Well, another lady went up there. Well, this one lady seemed like she may have been a little bit drunk. She was not dressed very nice. So everybody's going, oh my God. And so this other lady went up there and she asked them, I ordered my food like 15 minutes ago. Do you have it? And then all of a sudden there was a line that formed behind this lady because she was better dressed and she was very polite when she asked the individual. So all of a sudden, and she got her food. So everybody started lining up behind this lady. Nobody lined up behind the little short drunk lady. It's really kind of fascinating. But there you go. It has to do with cohesiveness and identifying with select individuals. I went up and got my hamburger, and the guy said, well, here you go, boss. I was the only person he called boss. I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm a white guy. I have no idea. I don't feel like the boss, but maybe that's why. There were other white people there, taller and older and uglier than me, with a white beard. I know. And he called them boss as well, so I just found that kind of interesting. Researchers were interested to find out if subjects were as group-oriented in a private response as when their response is public. Research shows that when the response is public, people feel much more comfortable to conform than if they are allowed to express their opinions in a secret ballot. It is easier to express your opinion in private rather than allowing yourself to be held up to public ridicule. This is really kind of interesting because Iowa doesn't have, what do they call it? Their elections are caucuses, so everybody has to stand up. And what they will do, they'll all get into a big room and they'll say, well, everybody for, Bernie Sanders, go over to that side. Everybody for Hillary Clinton, go over to that side. Everybody for whoever else is the candidate, go over there. So here you are, you're standing there. I mean, talk about being being set up for public ridicule. Well, I'm a Democrat, so I was in that room. The Republican room is really kind of interesting because they do it by secret ballot in the Republican room. So they, I don't know, they had Ted Cruz and Donald Trump, and I don't know, they were like Marco Rubio. And Rubio thought he was going to win, but Cruz actually won. But it was a secret ballot. It wasn't, by the time we were done in the Democratic section, since we were all standing up and everybody was looking at us, and my wife, I stood up for Bernie Sanders. My wife stood up for Hillary Clinton. So she actually gave a speech trying to convince Sanders people to come over to her side. And of course nobody did, and I certainly didn't. And people were laughing because they knew that we were married to each other. So they said, you're not, well, I can't tell you what they said, but they said something about no sex tonight. So. And they were right. They were correct. It's really kind of funny. Anyway. But that's the way they do it in Iowa. And so they have a caucus. And the caucus, everybody stands up and you stand up for your candidate. It's really kind of fascinating. But the Republicans, like I said, the Republicans don't do it that way. And one of the reasons is because, I don't know what the reason is, but it seems to me that is, you're actually stating who you're for and who you're against, I guess. Prior commitment, anyone who has ever participated in a sporting event where there are judges, umpires, or referees knows that once an official makes a decision on a play, they very rarely will change their mind, even if they are obviously wrong. There was an individual that was pitching a perfect game, and it was in the 9th inning, and it was a bunt down the line, and the pitcher picked up the ball and threw it underhand to the first baseman, and the throw beat the guy, but the umpire called him safe. And everybody in the stands is going, oh my God. And of course it was televised. And everybody, they said, and they kept replaying it, and they said, he's wrong, the umpire's wrong, the umpire's wrong, the umpire's wrong. And this thing went on for like a week. They were showing it, and they were saying, he stopped this guy's perfect game. He stopped this guy's no-hitter because it was a base hit. So it was a one-hit shutout. And the umpire, of course, it was obvious that the umpire was incorrect. And of course, the umpire saw the replays, and he apologized to the pitcher for messing up his no-hitter and his perfect game. And the player said, it's baseball. What the hell? It was really kind of interesting. But, everybody's screaming. The whole stands are screaming. And the other umpires came around. But, of course, this is a judgment call, and you can't really question a judgment call. Anyway, it was really kind of an interesting situation. So if you've got an umpire, you've got a referee or whatever, a lot of times they can't change their mind. Because if they do, they will be ridiculed more for their weakness than for any other reason. Researchers have discovered that once an individual makes a public decision, they very rarely will recant their decision, even under overwhelming social pressure. And of course, that's what was going on with the umpire. Hence, arguing with an official may only steel their hearts against you. In other words, the more you complain to the umpire, the more likely that you're going to get the bad calls. The best course, of course, is to not set the official up for public ridicule. However, social ridicule, the reality is that there are pitchers, there are baseball players, there are basketball players that will do this. LeBron James, Michael Jordan, when he was playing basketball, would complain about calls. He would get calls because he was Michael Jordan. Same thing with LeBron James, same thing with football players. Tom Brady's used to getting the calls, and when he doesn't get the calls, He complains, and of course then they go to of course it's in New England where everybody complains about everything anyway. Yeah, so sometimes individuals will actually do that. Pitchers, when Greg Maddux was pitching, Greg Maddux was a wonderful pitcher. I mean, he was a very good pitcher. But if he wasn't getting the calls on the outside corner or the low pitches, he would complain to the umpire, and he would get the people in the stands. It's when he was pitching in Chicago. He'd get the people in the stands to scream, and when he was pitching in Atlanta. So he'd get the calls because the umpire was afraid of the social ridicule. People may conform to a group for one of two different reasons. One is normative influence, and the other is informational influence. Normative influence is conformity that is based on the individual's desire to be accepted and avoid rejection of the group. This is known as going along with the crowd. That's normative influence. And the other is informational influence. Conformity is based on the individual's acceptance of reality provided by other people. And of course, this is what's going on with the news agencies. And this is one of the reasons why Donald Trump is attacking the media, because there is one media group that supports him, and there are lots of others that are saying negative things about him. Well, he calls the negative people that say negative things about him the fake news. That's what he refers to them as. He's trying to get he's trying to get the other people in the United States, the people in the United States, to get tired of all of this arguing back and forth. Most people don't like politics. Most people don't want to think about politics. They only want to think about politics when the day before they have to vote. That's the only time they want to think about it. And here we have politics every day. Every day something is going on. What he's trying to do, he's trying to make us fatigued with the whole idea of politics so that we just reject it. As interesting and curious as that is. So he's trying to get his reality, which is the reality from Fox News. He wants people to accept that reality. He wants them to conform. He wants them to conform to that form of informational conformity. Wanting to be correct and accepting someone else's opinion is who is more knowledgeable, and of course that's what he's saying. These people know more about Fox News is far more accurate than CNN or MSNBC or CBS or whatever. Research shows that some people are more susceptible than others, but that personality tests are more predictors of conformity. Researchers discovered that when social influences are weak, then personality is more predictive of behavior, and thus they are more likely to conform. Situation certainly influences whether the individual will dare to dissent or to conform. If you were at a Trump rally and he said something that you didn't agree with, the probability that you're going to go against 25,000 people, stand up and scream is fairly is hardly a possibility at all. For one thing, people would shout you down, and then you also might be attacked.
That's probably what he's going through today. He's out in California.
Oh, is he out in California?
And they're saying that they have a lot of protesters already standing by.
Well, this should be interesting. Where in California is he going?
San Diego.
Is he going to San Diego? A relatively conservative area. He does have strong points out there. Orange County, for example, Fullerton County. I'm surprised he's not going to Fullerton, CS Fullerton, or to there's another school out there. What is it? Really conservative school. It's in Fullerton County as well. Oh, I can't think of it. Is anybody taking the class with Sarah, the psychology and law? Her textbook is written by two of those guys, two guys from that conservative institution. Oh God, I tangled with people from that school before. I had I have a degree in international relations, and I was overseas when I got the degree. And one of my instructors was a former CIA agent from this college. Oh God, he was like a Nazi. He was so conservative. It was ridiculous. Oh man, boy, I'll tell you what, we locked horns like every class period. And of course, he kept telling me things like, you know, I can kill you in 102 different ways. I'm thinking, go ahead, let's see which one of this comes out on top. I mean, wrong is wrong, right? Whether he's a CIA agent or not. Turns out that sure he worked for the CIA, but there is counterintelligence. It's spreading misinformation, and that's actually what he worked in. Oh, shit, like I didn't know that. Repeating Ash's conformity experiments around the world, researchers have discovered that different cultures have different levels of conformity. 30% conformity in Lebanon, Brazil, and Hong Kong, but 51% conformity among Bantu tribesmen of Zimbabwe. Possibly the least conforming population were the very individualistic French. If you remember, during the build-up to the first Iraq War, the French were against it, George W. Bush. So the French were against it, and they came out publicly against the war in Iraq. Of course, he went ahead and attacked, weapons of mass destruction. He's looking for weapons of mass destruction. Really kind of fascinating because Congress, which was being controlled by the Republicans at the time, they were so pissed off at the French that they changed the name of French fries to freedom fries. I was living up in Montana at the time, and I would order French dressing, and nobody had French dressing anymore. They had Catalina, was what they referred to French dressing as. So I was really kind of bizarre. I still said I wanted French dressing. And of course, everybody's really shocked that I even say the name French. Really kind of interesting. I've told you about my friend that just died. A hyper-conservative guy. He hated the French, despised the French, not just because they did not back George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq, but he hated the French because of World War II. And he would say all these negative things about the French, like they were cowards and they wouldn't fight. The reality is that the French have been controlling genocide in Africa for an extended length of time, since the 1960s. So they're not cowardly at all. My father-in-law was with Patton during World War II, and the artillery unit that supported them was a French artillery unit. And several instances, Patton would get himself stuck in a bad situation where they needed to retreat, and the French artillery unit would not retreat until the infantry were all taken care of. Usually they pull out they pull out the artillery as support, and then the infantry retreats. That's usually the way it works, but the French wouldn't do that. And they were almost captured a couple times because of that. That's how brave they were. They were given all kinds of interesting commendations, not only by the French government, but also by the American government. They were given unit citations because of their support for our guys. As many parents have discovered, challenging a child's behavior can sometimes lead to the child acting in the opposite manner to exert their freedom and individuality. This is known as reactance, acting to protect your own sense of freedom. Parents can limit this type of reaction from their children by offering them choices instead of commands. If you order them to do something, then of course that's not really, then it's easy for them to react in a negative manner. But if you give them choices and force them to make a choice, you're less likely to get that reaction. And this is known as reactance. Researchers in Canada have found that it may be the laws against underage drinking that lead to as much underage drinking as there is. We have this argument with the Canadians all the time. The Canadians have far more liberal laws as far as drinking and marijuana smoking is concerned. And we have this argument with them from time to time. In the United States, of course, we're far more conservative. We have prohibition. They never did have prohibition. And for this reason, of course, we get really interesting research coming out of Canada. A survey in 1997 found that while a whopping 69% of 21 to 24-year-olds had been drunk at least once the year before, 77% of those 18 to 20 had been drunk the year before. So as you can see, it's almost 10% more people that are underage are drinking than people that are of age are drinking. A similar study in the United States college campuses showed 75% drinking rates for those of age, but 81% drinking rates for those under the age of 21. As interesting and strange as that is. And that's what a drunk person looks like. You see anything interesting about that guy besides he's almost passed out drunk? Do you see anything odd about this guy? Look at his elbow. It's bent backwards. He's double jointed in the elbow.
What causes it?
It's genetics. It's not the fact that he's so snockered. It's not exactly sure if he's got shoes on or not. Here's one shoe. I don't know where the other. Maybe that's it. His other shoe over there. He's passed out. Oh, drunk people. They're so much fun. Further research into teenage drinking by Ruth Ings and David Hansen in 1989 showed that while 15% of legal age students are heavy drinkers, 24% of underage students are heavy drinkers. So you're more likely to have heavy drinkers than the people that can't even get booze. Where the hell are they getting booze? Could it be 30-year-olds that are hoping to get lucky? I don't know. Let's hope that's not what it is. It's possible, I guess. Oops. Just as the preacher's kid is the wildest, the Catholic schoolgirls are reputed to be the most sexually active. Rampant alcohol and drug use among teenagers may be a reactance against restrictions. Maybe that's the way it is. Maybe it's reactance. And there's another group of drinkers. I have no idea what his shirt says. This is from drinkingpictures.com. I don't even know if they still exist. I know. Their hair's kind of long for these modern times. What are they drinking? Is that Coors? Maybe. I like the guy with the pipe in the back. While people are pressured to conform by their dominant group, they also seek uniqueness. People will go to great ends to declare their uniqueness, from hairstyles to body piercings and body art. I told you that I have a nephew, wonderful kid. He's just a super kid. He does water control, water purity in our hometown is what he does. This kid has so many tattoos on his body that he's completely painted from his neck down. I have never seen his pubic region. I have no idea if that's tattooed as well, but I know all of his arms and legs up and up through his neck. His neck up to here is tattooed. His hands aren't tattooed, but right down to his wrist. Looks like he's wearing a bodysuit when I've seen him. When asked who they are, people tend to point out their differences from the norm rather than to chronicle their similarities. When a minority of any kind, that aspect seems to stick out like a sore thumb. In Korea, my gray hair set me more apart than my race. They didn't really see me as that much different from everybody else as far as race was concerned, but because I had gray hair, they thought I was really, really old, so they would give me their seats. At one point, an individual gave me an umbrella. It was raining, and I didn't have an umbrella. And they gave me an umbrella, which is kind of interesting. They make umbrellas out of plastic trash bags and bamboo, which, like $1 or something. Anyway, so some people are unique, and they seek uniqueness. Tell me if you think that guy's unique. Or that lady. I'm not exactly sure if it's a male or a female. But that's a lot of piercings. Pretty unique, I'd say. And they dyed their hair red. How about that guy? That's pretty unique. No? Yes? Weird spot. Yeah. How about her? Look at that. She's, I know. She has implants in her forehead. These spikes coming out of her head are actually implanted in her head. She's a lawyer in London. Can you imagine? Going to court and talking to this lady? Or her being your lawyer? There you go. How about that? How do you eat? Unique
Is it a straw?
I guess. I don't know. I like the one right at the end of the nose. There's the guy. Is that what women are looking for? He's hot. Especially his ear. My nephew, has a painted body, he was doing this with his ear, and then he decided to stop. And it just grows right back. I mean, it was kind of interesting. He had big holes in his ears. And then all of a sudden, he just stopped, and it just kind of grew back together. Really kind of weird. Okay, one more. What does that say? S-E-C-R-E. It must be French. She's got pentagrams. She's got a bat on her forehead. That's so cool, huh?
There's two.
Yeah. Oh yeah, she's got another bat. Maybe she's got one on the other side too. Wow, that's hot, isn't it? How about? We're gonna have dreams tonight. Okay. I like her teeth. Oh, life is so interesting, isn't it? And that's the end of chapter 8, conformity. So I've actually covered a chapter. Next time we'll tackle chapter 9. It's time.